Awesome. Well, hey, Nick, I appreciate you for having me on. I'll go and dive right into this. So my topic for today is titled Returning to Play in Uncertain Times. I think it's fitting considering the world that we're living in at this moment. And the reality is that many of us have been experiencing hardships. So I hope everyone out there that your families are well, that you're safe, that you're employed, that you're working, and we'll just move right into this presentation. So what to expect? STATSports has done a phenomenal job in bringing together top practitioners from around the world and all the webinars that they've hosted over the past couple months. And so with all that, many other companies have done the same. My goal for today is not to speak so much technically and dive into the nuts and bolts of athlete monitoring and how it pertains to sports performance, but really to just provide insights into my current setup here at Sporting Kansas City and Major League Soccer and how we arrived to where we are in the current landscape. So for those of you that are outside the US or are unfamiliar, I'll spend a little bit of time just touching on Major League Soccer as a whole and what Sporting Kansas City is as an organization. I'm going to touch on the current state of affairs, providing a little bit of a story and just giving insights into how Sporting Kansas City got from where they were in 2019, what we expected coming into 2020, and the outcomes that came out of that. And then ultimately just the learnings that I've had throughout this time period. Ultimately, I think I've had a bit of a paradigm shift, lots of time to process the way that I am viewing my job as a whole, as a practitioner, and how I approach the athletes that I work with, and then how that pertains with insights into my planning process. So Major League Soccer, it's a young league, the youngest in the US of the major professional sports leagues, much younger than most of the professional soccer or football teams around the world. It was birthed in 1996. This is actually the 25th anniversary of the league this season. There are 26 teams currently in Major League Soccer. For this season, we played 34 league matches, 17 home, 17 away, and additional potential 4 playoff matches. It's a 10-month season. We're provided a 5-week preseason, a 32-week in-season, a 6-week postseason. Obviously, if you make it to the MLS Cup final, and if you make it to the Cup final, you have a 9-week off-season. Other potential competitions are the US Open Cup, somewhat similar to FA Cup in England, with the potential of 6 matches, the CONCACAF Champions League's potential of 8 to 10 games, and Leagues Cup with another additional 4 matches with Liga MX. A little bit of insight and laying the groundwork for my presentation today is entering 2020, Sporting Kansas City had only 3 less than 7-day, or what we would call normal microcycles or normal weeks, which seemed like an optimal season, optimal schedule for us. We were able to really fine tune our training plan, our training methodology, hoping that we were able to stabilize the way that we trained, which would set us up for success in the end. Ultimately, everything turned for a different direction, and it's where we are today, currently in Orlando, Florida, at the MLS's Back tournament. So before I move on, I just want to give a little bit of insight into our club structure here at Sporting Kansas City, touching on our technical staff, our sports performance staff, and our sports medicine staff in particular. The reason I just want to touch on this is not necessarily to talk about Sporting as a club, but just to give credit where credit's due. The people that I work with are unbelievable. We have a great team that is very collaborative, that communicates very well, and that is led by our head coach and sporting director, Peter Vermees. Peter has done a phenomenal job in the way that he has directed our organization during this time period, and ultimately the way that he's been a leader within the league. He's played an influential role into where we are today and how the league was able to enter into individual trainings, small group trainings, and ultimately get back to playing games, which I'm grateful for. Along the technical staff, Peter has 2 assistant coaches, a goalkeeper coach, and a tactical analyst that all play important roles as well. I'm the director of sports performance and science at the club. We have a head strength conditioning coach and a team dietitian that also work with me in the sports performance side. On the sports medicine side, Kurt Andrews is our director, and I just have to give a shout out to Kurt because ultimately with our ability to get back on the field, Kurt's handled a lot. He's been able to put together and manage a lot of different processes and protocols to make sure that we're able to do so safely. And working with the league, working with healthcare professionals in Kansas City, here in Orlando, him and his team have handled a lot. So credit where credit's due. I'm grateful for all of them. We have an assistant athletic trainer full-time on the sports medicine side, as well as a physical therapist who acts as our rehab coordinator and our team massage therapist. Not to be cheesy, but our goal is always to just eliminate silos in our organization, starting from top down with Peter. And it's not just these three departments, it's our equipment managers, our team administration. Everyone plays a critical role in what we do on a daily basis. And that's why I wanted to show our core values, because they really do just represent everything that Sporting Kansas City stands for. With team first as number one, our second is winning mentality on and off the field, work ethic and intelligence with those in the organization and outside the organization. So just a little bit of insight and kind of painting a picture of the current state of affairs and where we've come from. Sporting had a disappointing season in 2019 where we didn't make the playoffs for the first time in 10 years, which led us to our longest off-season period that we've ever experienced, 15 weeks. And after that off-season, we began preseason on January 18th, a 5-week build-up leading to the 25th MLS season, where we had our first game on February 29th. Ultimately, we were able to get through 2.5 weeks playing 2 matches. And as we were building up for our third match, on March 12th, we actually got notification from the league that there was going to be a 30-day game moratorium where we knew that we were not going to be playing games for the next 30 days. What we didn't know is what the training moratorium was going to look like. So initially, we weren't aware that we weren't going to be able to train. Government had not come out with many recommendations, at least locally, on what that would look like for us. There wasn't anything hard set from that standpoint. And so the league started to announce 1 week at a time, a training moratorium. So for the next 4 weeks, we'd get the notice at the end of the week that we're not allowed to train the next week. During that time period, here in the U.S., the city and the state governments are varying, right? So all the MLS teams are experiencing different constraints in regards to what they're able to do in their home market. It wasn't until April 3rd that we got a lengthy training moratorium until April 24th. So slightly before the 3rd, we started to realize that this was going to last a lot longer than we thought. So we had to start putting some different plans in place. On April 23rd, right before they announced it, we had another moratorium extended through May 14th, which leads us to our return to training. We started individual training where players were segregated to quadrants on one soccer field at our facility, only 4 players to one field. They were not allowed to pass the ball with each other. They were not allowed to have access to the facility. But ultimately, we were able to get the guys and perform work for 4 weeks. After the individual training on May 6th, we entered small group training on June 1st, which that only lasted a week for us because at that moment, the league also announced that starting on June 8th, we would be able to start team training. During that small group training week, the players were also in CBA negotiations with the league, which took them out of training for 3 days. So again, just painted a picture of kind of everything that has led us to where we are. And once we started team training on June 8th, we had 4 weeks to build up for where we are currently, the MLS is Back tournament. Games at this tournament started on July 8th, and the tournament ultimately is 5 weeks in length. 24 teams are in the tournament currently, 6 groups of 4. There's 26 teams in MLS. 2 teams were removed due to a high number of players having contracted the virus. So unfortunate for them. Currently, we're in a bubble in Orlando with very high restrictions. And the league has actually done a very good job in organizing this and making it fairly safe for everyone involved. Like I said before, heading into 2020, we did not have that dense of a schedule. And now as we restart the season, we have 7 games in 31 days. So this whole process of going from the end of our last offseason to where we are now has forced us to adjust and adapt and find solutions to the problems at hand. And ultimately, that's evaluating our processes and questioning a lot of things to hopefully make ourselves better. Last piece of the tournament is with those 7 games, there are 3 group stage games that all count towards league play. And after the 3 group stage games, two teams from each group will move on, and 2 third place teams from the 2 conferences will also move on. Then you'll go to 4 single game elimination matches, leading to the MLS's back cup. And we are unsure what the rest of the season will look like at this point. Obviously, hope to continue play and finish out the season the best we can. So as I mentioned, during this whole period and time off and dealing with the athletes a little bit more in the virtual world than the everyday, and being home a lot more, I was forced to really evaluate how we were approaching our planning process. And the Cynefrin Framework, which I believe I said it right, is a framework that has really stood out to me over the last couple months. There's 5 quadrants in this framework: the obvious, complicated, complex, chaos, and then ultimately disorder, which you're trying to avoid. You're basically going from simple to complex, going from controlled to chaotic. And ultimately, the idea is that this complicated process is kind of what I realized I was guilty of assuming sport landed in, right? Team sport, that you would sense, you would analyze, you respond, that we would be able to have a good understanding and create hypotheses to predict outcomes using different models, that we would be fairly certain of the knowns and the unknowns. And due to the complex world that we're living in, and most importantly, because sport is complex, I came to the conclusion that sport should most definitely be in the complex quadrant. And it's just this idea that we're able to probe, sense, and respond, and ultimately develop this emergent practice where we have to hold our planning a little bit more loosely. So if you haven't looked at the Cynefrin Framework, I highly suggest that you dive into it. This leads into a lot of the work by Mladen Jovanovic through his Agile Periodization model. And John Kiley has also had a number of papers that have touched on this whole idea of the complex learning model. And ultimately, what he says is that we are always navigating between having a planning with rigidity, that we're holding on to our plans so tightly, and on the other side of the spectrum, a formless lack of training direction. So somewhere in the middle, we have to make sure that we're not holding too tightly, but we do have a plan. We need a structured framework, yet we also need one that is flexible and tolerant of change. And Mladen suggests this is where utilizing heuristic planning and iterative planning really come into play. And the idea of these heuristics is that it's just a rule of thumb where you're sifting through all the information to ultimately determine what is good enough for the desired outcome, or what is the minimal viable product to achieve that outcome, if optimization is not possible. And so when we're dealing with uncertainty, which sport is uncertain, we have to deal with different heuristics that we know to determine what we believe we can control. And that's where it becomes agile on a day-to-day basis, is where you plan. And instead of focusing on delivering and achieving an outcome, you're daily making iterations based on what occurred and being able to assess what happened to then improve on the next day. Plan your microcycle and daily make your iterations. And I believe the quote from George Box, where he says, "All models are wrong, but some are useful," fits perfectly here. This whole idea of contemporary periodization and upfront planning, top-down approach, all useful, not wrong, but we need to make sure that we're able to hold all of that very loosely. Which leads us to 3 questions that are very critical when planning in the performance domain. When should it be done? How should it be done? And how do we minimize the risk of being wrong? Ultimately, as physical preparation coaches, high-performance practitioners, sports scientists, whatever your role is, we should be trying to mitigate risk, and whatever that risk is. I believe in this scenario, as we're approaching a condensed preseason, as we just came out of that on our end, that the idea is that we're trying to mitigate the risk of injury. And ultimately, by mitigating the risk of injury, we're trying to assess what may cause injuries and what do we believe we can affect change on. And some of those things are avoiding excessive exposure to the wrong stimulus too soon, avoiding monotonous exposure, and the list goes on. Ultimately, as we're beginning to plan this process and we're evaluating our model, there's many methods that are available to us as we're trying to bring our players back to fitness and do so in a safe manner. I've just thrown some out here. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, But as you can see, you have match exposure, small-sided, medium-sided, large-sided games, different endurance training methods, HIIT training, aerobic high intensity, speed training, speed endurance, max velocity, resistance training, injury prevention. I mean, you can go on. But ultimately, the idea is that you have all these methods available. And if you're to try and plan this out like you may typically plan it out as an off-season period or a preseason period, you may find it challenging to fit all of that in when it's a condensed period. So you have to approach this with 3 heuristics. And Mladen says the first heuristic is make it simple. Identify for yourself what your 4 primary methods or qualities are that you hope to affect change on, and prioritize those methods. It doesn't mean that the other ones won't occur, but you just have to eventually put them in an order of what you believe is most important and prioritize those in that way. The heuristic number 2 is to distribute the load evenly, or to diversify the methods that you're using. We want to provide a baseline of exposure to the players as we start off this process of returning from this home period and understanding that the players are most likely going to come in a detrained state. And so we don't want to focus too much on one quality and saturate them by exposing them with that one quality, but provide a balanced approach to your primary methods to achieve those qualities. And the last is eventually you're going to have to invest in the upside. And for us, match exposure is going to be the most important variable. And I don't mean just match exposure as it is to playing friendlies, but match exposure as it pertains to playing your game model and training as you play. And ultimately, if the players have to get back to playing games sooner than they typically would, we need to get back to training and improving them from a soccer standpoint. I think the basis of agile periodization is really trying to differentiate between what is optimal and what is robust planning strategies. The example given here by Mladen is that the optimal day to do speed training or to saturate speed qualities would be on game day +3 or game day +4. But if the player is unable to participate in a session where that quality is focused on, such as a speed day on a game day +4, then you're now forced to decide, does the player not get that quality or that training for the week? Or do you move it to a different day that is less optimal? And at that point, maybe you're not able to do the desired work that was planned. A more robust training strategy would be to take Derek Hansen's microdosing approach and focus on that quality, in this instance, speed, and microdose that quality throughout the week. It doesn't have to be every day. It can be a couple days a week, but you're making sure that you're providing exposure to the athlete no matter what happens. And so you're accounting for the worst case scenarios, though you know that it might not be optimal, you know that it's good enough, which makes the model more robust. Again, not trying to dive too deep into all these periodization models or specific methods, but just trying to paint a picture for the thought process as we're dealing with this uncertainty in return to play. I think this quote from Dwight Eisenhower is very influential. He says, "In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." I'm not saying that we don't plan and that we ignore the classical or traditional thinking as it pertains to periodization. We just need to make sure that we're planning enough to be able to make daily iterations along the way. We need to make sure we're collecting enough information to make intelligent decisions as we're working throughout our microcycle. Now just taking a step back and looking at this whole COVID-19 pandemic and how it pertains to the off-season period, is I believe both of those periods have some resemblances. The players are coming from a point where they have achieved a high level of fitness, that they ideally are in form, playing a couple of games in the season, finishing the season, to now coming to a down period. And so before I get into anything else, the biggest rock for us as Sporting Kansas City is that we just wanted to establish, for athletes, we believe they're humans first, right? The relationship aspect is massive. Though we want to make sure that we're focusing on everything that we need from a training perspective, we first want to address how are they doing and how can we support them. I mean, there's players on our team who their wives work full-time, their daycare was closed, and so now all of a sudden they're thrust into being a full-time dad. Well, that changes their schedule. It could be a blessing for them and they get time with their family, but it's different. And so now their priorities are a little bit changed. They don't have the time that they once had to be able to focus on their training. And so now we have to be able to accommodate them and ask them, how can we assist you in achieving your goals? Along the lines of the athlete motivation, one thing that we did was establish target dates. The biggest difference between this COVID-19 pandemic and the off-season period was that at the end of off-season, you have a date. You know what you're preparing for. You can take the end date and you can work backwards from that. Same for preseason. The same for the players. You have players who may take it easy the first part of off-season, knowing that they can ramp it up towards the end of off-season. But this was different. We didn't have an end date. And so we took the approach where we spoke with the players, got the veteran players on board and said, hey, let's make sure we're in this as a team. Let's make sure that we are supporting each other. And let's set a work period of 2 weeks and then a deload week. And I don't mean a deload week from the standpoint that our training was too intensive that the players need to recover from it. But maybe it was a deload week where we didn't do any more Zoom workouts, where they didn't have to hear my voice. A deload week where we weren't going to ask them to report their times. Just a week where they could focus on themselves and their family while we're still providing them with training to do. The next piece is maybe the more obvious one with the residual training effects, table from Vladimir Asurin. And the idea is obviously that your neuromuscular qualities are going to deteriorate quicker if you're not provided exposure to them, your speed, your strength, and your power. So optimally, those are the qualities that we want to make sure that we're touching on during this period. If we come back, the players are going to be detrained as it pertains to those qualities. But we have to ask the question, is it possible? Are the players willing to go outside? Were they willing to go to the parks and perform speed work? Were they motivated enough to do the plyometric workouts that we asked them to? Did they have the equipment to do max strength training? In most cases, no. So we had to sift through and prioritize what the qualities were that we were going to focus on. And ultimately, we went with a very general and generic model to maintain the base level of fitness that these guys had, hopefully provide them with some sort of hypertrophy stimulus, base level of strength, so that when they came back, that we could keep them in a moderate exposure to specific qualities. This idea is that in the off-season period, you might be able to follow a sequential or unidirectional approach as you're doing your planning, maybe working from extensive to intensive, maybe using a funnel method where you're incorporating high speed and low speed. In this period, we chose more of a mixed approach, targeting more extensive work while also focusing on strength work, focusing on our high intensity aerobic work, just making sure that we were alternating the stimuluses on the days within the week so the players had the variety of exposure and that minimal base as they return to training. The next piece that has been very beneficial to us as we transition from this COVID-19 home program to the in comparison to the off-season period was categorizing the training drills and exercises that we were using, from isolated qualities to soccer exercises themselves. And I took this idea from Paco Cirlo. I'm sure I butchered his name, but I love his work from his structured training model out of FC Barcelona. And the concept follows a lot of Bondarchuk principles, where it goes with a categorization of generic, general, directed, special, and competition. The generic training is going to be basic and distant from the sport. And this may be something that is a rowing session or a bike session to improve aerobic capacity. The general training method is going to be less distant from sport, but still focusing on isolated physical qualities. This is where your steady state running could fit in. This is where your high intensity intervals could fit in. The third is your directed method. The directed method is going to be soccer related, though it requires unspecific decision making. This may involve tactical and technical requirements as it pertains to the position. An example of this could be a winger performing a circuit on the field in our individual training, where maybe the end goal is that they're improving their ability to cross the ball and their ability to focus on runs in behind the defense while focusing on a speed quality from a physical perspective. The special method is going to be more specific to the game model. It's going to be your small-sided games, 3v3s, 4v4s, and then the last is going to be your competition that is most specific to the game model, your 11v11s, box to box, maybe in one half, where you have specific tactical requirements of that game. So the way that we laid it out for our 4 phases of return to play was we had our at-home program. And like I stated, this was our generic and our general focus. We really had to individualize this based on what the players had. And like I said, what their motivation level, what they're willing to do, while giving them some sort of level of structure and some sort of level of accountability. And one way that we attacked both of those was scheduling Zoom workouts with our team. I know many teams around the world did this, but for us, it was really beneficial in just bringing the guys together and letting them see each other's face and having some sort of social interaction with their teammates. The second piece was we distributed a lot of dumbbells, kettlebells, different medicine balls, weight training equipment from our facility to outfit the players the best we could so they had at least the minimum resources to continue their training program from home. We also did this with bikes, rowing machines, to most of our players, trying to give different options just to break up the monotony in what they're doing. And then the last piece is being able to just focus on getting a little bit of volume and maintaining their ability to run through high intensity aerobic work. After the at-home program, as I said, we had our MLS individual training protocol, and this is just a screenshot from what our protocol looked like with the league, where you had 4 players lined up on the field, 6 feet, moats, if you will, in between each quadrant, 20 yards in between fields. Players had an hour and a half, or they had an hour time slot. We had 30 minutes to clean, make sure the players were out before the next group could come in. And this is where we focused on a lot of our directed training. With the directed training, this is where we did a lot of our circuits, and that became a heavy emphasis here, while we still sprinkled in our general training, though the general work became a little bit more specific. We understood that these guys had not been exposed to movements that are related to the game of soccer: cutting, change of direction, accelerations, sprinting over distance. And so we wanted to start introducing those movements while we were reintroducing soccer actions themselves. And the third was the MLS small group training protocol. This, again, would have been fairly similar, with your directed being the high bias and your general, again, being a little bit more specific as it pertains to what we're trying to improve. Though for us, we only had small group training for 4 days. So really, it was just the first opportunity we were allowed 6 players to one half of the field. The players had to social distance, but they could perform patterns to goal. They could perform passing exercises. They could do a number of different things that we were unable to do in the MLS individual training protocol. And ultimately, it just added a level of reactive thinking to it. You had to react to the player turning with the ball and playing it back to you and thinking like a soccer player. And then the last stage is our MLS team training. And the most important thing for us is beginning to work backwards so that we can train as we play. As we talk about this MLS team training, the biggest things that we have to understand as we return to a preseason period, as we return to an in-season period, and as we are building up, and especially in this consolidated manner that we have been, it's very important to understand the coach's plan. The coach's plan is going to be as it relates to his system of play, the formation that the team uses, his tactics, how that pertains to the individual position, the back line, the middle line, the front attacking line, and the team as a whole. His special tactics that might relate to individual positional requirements in the moments of the game, transition from offense, transition from defense to offense, and then the strategy relating to different competitions or upcoming opponents. I think from this quote, begin with the end in mind, it's very critical for us to think about the physical demands in this way, to think about what are we trying to prepare them for, and at minimum, we need to get there. So if it's 1 game in a week, if it's 1 game in 4 days, 1 game in 5 days, whatever it is, we need to determine the physical demands of that. And it first starts with the match and then the training sessions. So we work backwards from the end to get to where we want to be. And the last piece to understand as you're planning out this period is your coach open to isolated physical training? Is he open to directed training with a physical bias, exercises with the ball? Or does he want all the physical work to come out of training as you play, more your tactical periodization model? This quote from Stuart McMillan says, "The microcycle dictates the macrocycle." I think this is key as we begin to approach this period, especially in a condensed format.
The microcycle, along the idea of this tactical periodization model, is where you're utilizing this concept of horizontal alternation and specificity. Now, I'm not going to go into tactical periodization. I know that this is something that probably everyone watching has seen, but the idea is not that you're trying to train the physical through the game, but the physical is a result of training like you play. And so with that, as physical coaches, we always have to bucket our days to understand what qualities are being achieved on those days. And I believe that this model says it very concisely, where you have a strength day. On that strength day, you're probably going to see more change of directions. You're going to see more accelerations, more decelerations. This day is going to be smaller numbers, smaller spaces. You're going to have an endurance day. This endurance day is going to be longer durations for the session as a whole, potentially, but most importantly for the drills themselves. You're going to see higher volumes of work, total distance, high-speed running. This is going to be a day where the players are going to have a high cardiovascular response. The speed day is a day where you might see some max speed work. You're going to see 10-man patterns to goal. You're going to see different situations where the coach might be working on the offensive side of the game, like I mentioned, or maybe it's different pressing situations, or maybe it's formation. Whatever it is, it's the speed of action, it's the speed of thought in the way that you play. And the last days, you're going to be your activation, which is a reactive day prior to the game, hopefully to potentiate the system through the game as well. Short bouts, high intensity. Ultimately, as you talk about the microcycle, and if you want to talk about any other models, you're always going to see some sort of recovery phase lasting 2 days after the game. You're going to see some sort of acquisition or loading phase for 2 days in the week, and then you're going to see some sort of tapering phase at the end of the week. And ultimately, this whole concept is if you're able to train these qualities as you play the game and you're able to use this idea of horizontal alternation throughout the week, then you're able to stabilize your microcycle and you're able to maintain qualities as the season goes on without peaking, without detraining, but stabilization. Ultimately, from a data standpoint, I believe as sports scientists, sports performance coaches, we have to be good historians. We have to understand what the history is of our training plan, of our coach. Obviously, some circumstances make that more difficult. A new coach, a new team, so that's where you have to understand the infrastructure, get to know the coach. Being a good historian as it pertains to the data is critical. I think data is going to drive this process, and it has for us as we move forward. It's a target for ourselves, and to just be aware of where we are. Understanding where we are has allowed us to make iterations on the day, to then be able to change the upcoming day, to be able to change within the session, being aware of what's going to happen or what we believe to happen, and then changing when that doesn't happen. So some of the ways that we like to look at the data is going to be comparing it with respect to match demands. So on a daily basis, the percent of a player's maximum match day average and the amount of work he did in the session, the percent of the positional match day average, and compared to relative to what that position group or person in that position group did on that day. And then comparing days with respect to different day types. So a match day -4 with a strength emphasis compared to another match day -4 with a strength emphasis, if that's what was chosen. The percent of metrics can be used on that day compared to a similar day in the past. Utilizing that's going to help you determine the type of work that was done relative to where the players were at a point in time. And then it's up to you to determine at that point in time, is that a moment that you should be trying to recreate? Is it something that we should use as context, or should we throw it out? It's important to consider the similar week types, what happens with longer weeks greater than 7 days, what has worked in the past, assessing the risk that was associated with that. Did we have injuries? How was the team's performance? How were the wellness questionnaires? Trying to gather information with those different week types. Your normal weeks, 7 day, you're shorter than 7 days. And then lastly, one of the most important is being able to compare your drills. And for us, this has been really influential, is developing a drill library that speaks to our coach. So we can use the drills that he likes to use and be able to create a language that, as we're making recommendations for the week to come or for the microcycle that is upcoming, then we can communicate with his exercises that, hey, this exercise will fit in with the recommendations on this day as it pertains to space, numbers, and durations. And ultimately, if we can use the meters per minute for the metrics that we like to look at, then we're going to be able to get fairly good estimates if we have historical data on that. So a few examples of how we've been able to utilize this planning process in the consolidated preseason is, and a shout out to my good buddy Josh McAllister. He was a big help in just sharing ideas. He always is, but he's a brilliant soccer mind, and we were able to work through this model together and just being able to figure out a way to communicate to our coaches a very effective and simple strategy. And so what we did is we termed the metrics volume, speed, and muscle as simple terms for them to understand what we look at. Obviously, we look at more metrics, but these are just ones that we prioritize for the sake of communication. And our volume metrics are HML distance, total distance. Our speed metrics, high speed running, and distance zone 6 or sprint distance. And our muscle metrics is going to be explosive distance, accelerations, decelerations. So we're able to help understand what days are going to have more emphasis on those metrics, and then what types of sessions will elicit those types of metrics on the high, low, or moderate end of the scale. From that standpoint, those are going to be your number of players, the duration of your bouts, and the spaces associated with the drills. We're able to take that a step further with daily and weekly forecasting. Again, enough information available to set your plan and then making adjustments as you go. So the way I like to work is to provide the report to the coach at the beginning of the week with the recommendations on what the week is. So then when we go in to plan the training session, he already has an idea of what types of sessions we should be looking at, what types of drills we should be looking at through me providing those exercises ahead of time. These are all just arbitrary numbers, arbitrary drills, not sharing any proprietary information, but I think the concept has worked really well for us, and hopefully it will be valuable to some of you out there as well. And so the idea is that in that top row where it says team, we're able to set a target for numbers, but then also percent of match day. The first one says 3,100 meters total distance. That was a typo. It should have been 31,000 meters total distance, 31 kilometers, 5,000 meters HML, 2,000 high-speed running, and so on as you work down the end of the line. The bottom row is going to be what we actually achieved. So I've gone through on that bottom row and put in numbers of what I forecasted the week to look like on those days to get an estimate of what I believe the drills would entail. You'll see that on some of those we're a little bit higher than what the goal is. Some of them are a little bit lower. This provides flexibility in the planning so that as the week goes on and as the session's going on, I know what days of the week that we can have more flexibility, that we can go a little bit longer in a drill if the coach wants. If it's a day where I know we shouldn't, then that's where I can prioritize the moments that I want to address that and stand up for something that maybe we should be a little bit more aware of. Ultimately, it's not trying to control the process. It doesn't derail the process if we go over or if we go under, but the idea or the concept, I think, is still critical as we are able to mitigate risk through understanding what we did last week and being able to plan for what we're going to do next week as we're currently in the week that we're in. Communication is key. Every coach is going to like to see something different. Some are going to prefer bar charts, line charts. Some just prefer numbers. This is just an example of something that's worked for us on one of our coach reports. And being able to just simplify our metrics into categories has been really beneficial. And communicating the idea surrounding volume, speed, and muscle has worked very well in relation to the days that we try to elicit certain adaptations. And ultimately, we're just comparing the individual to themselves, and then to the position level, and then to the team level as it pertains to the max match day average and percent of. You can then categorize those percentages and build them into a weekly plan, and then be able to assess as a whole in communication. You can do this in 3 layers. This is just the team and the position level. We do it at the individual level as well, but being able to assess where you were as a quick snapshot from last week to this week. Again, trying to avoid excessive exposure too soon, while also trying to avoid big swings in training load. If we can make it progressive, and if there's a little bit of a drop off or a little bit of increase, then we know that that's going to be okay, and we're staying within a range that we feel comfortable. Ultimately, I think the biggest piece here is that you have to understand what your coach is trying to accomplish before you start trying to influence the training process with data. First, get a grasp on what the training model is, and then begin to work backwards. And if you have historical data, then it becomes really easy because you're able to work backwards from what the demands are going to be and what they need to be exposed to. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll throw it back to you, Nick.
That was Joey Harty, and that was a recording. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us today, but he very kindly agreed to record his presentation with his account manager, Nick, last night. So our thanks to Joey from Sporting KC for that. Hopefully you all were able to take away something from that one. Joey has also given his contact details there, because obviously you can't ask a question because he's not here. He welcomes your feedback and any questions that you do have through his Twitter handle there, which is